We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Hey guys! The video for today will be the part 4 of What If Naruto Traveled to the World of Harry Potter. The trust of a child is a fragile thing. Naruto becomes disenchanted with Konoha and the Sandaime Hokage when he stumbles upon the truth of who and what he is on his 8th birthday. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 13, Full Circle. Saturday, September 1, 2001, Sunrise. Mt. Asahi, Hokkaido, Japan. Yama no Kuni, Elemental Nations. Harry stood in front of the portal holding the reins of the newly named Felix Felicis, or Felix for short. One of the two Andalusian geldings, the other gelding had been named Fidelis. He wasn't quite sure what he was supposed to feel now that it was time for the 5 of them, 6 if he counted Minato's spirit, to leave behind the world he'd grown up in. The one thing he knew for certain was that he felt a whole new level of respect for Naruto and the courage it must have taken for his little cousin to make this journey, alone when he was only 8 years old. "What are you waiting for, Nizan?" Naruto inquired in Japanese from his perch on the driver's seat of the Vardo beside Dudley. "Courage to face whatever we will find on the other side," Harry replied in kind as he tightened his hold on Felix's reins and hesitantly placed his right hand flat against the hand-shaped indent near the center of the seal that had been carved into the massive stone that held the portal and began channeling his chakra into the seal to activate the array. 8 pairs of eyes watched the lines of Harry's chakra race through the seals carved into the stone. The hard lines of the seal array glowing blue as he continued to pour chakra into the stone until the entire design was glowing brightly. The moment he dropped his hand, the wall shimmered in the light of the seals for several seconds before the light seemed to melt into the very stone to form a doorway of what looked like water. Locking away his doubts and fears, Harry lifted his chin a notch higher and squared his shoulders before he entered the open portal, Felix dutifully following in his wake when the horse's reins drew taut. The wizard exited through the other side of the portal mere seconds later to find himself standing on an older mountain range that had been worn smooth by countless centuries of harsh winds. By the time Felix's tail had passed through the portal, Harry had created 24 Kage Bunshin without breaking his stride and set them to scouting the immediate vicinity. A short search turned up a small scrub brush a dozen meters from the portal door and Harry quickly wrapped Felix's reins around the base of the bush before he used his wand to create a clear path for the wagons as the lead team of Shires pulling the Vardo crested the portal. Once he was certain he had created a large enough area to hold all 4 wagons and the extra horses, Harry tucked away his wand and climbed up inside of the Vardo to inspect their traveling supplies and the enchantments on the wagon, to confirm that both had passed through the portal unharmed and unchanged, a process that was repeated with all 3 of the remaining wagons and their cargo. His next task was to ask one of his elves to attempt to use magic to transport back to Japan, a feat that was easily accomplished due to the fact that the complex barriers that separated the elemental countries from the outer countries had no way to block magical travel. Harry, on the other hand, could not use his magic to travel between the 2 dimensions due to his chakra network. The elves were creatures of pure magic, much like phoenixes, and therefore did not have chakra networks because magic was their life force. Still, knowing that the elves could freely travel back and forth would make things much easier for the now transplanted family of 5, Naruto had come to see the outer countries as home since it was out there that he had found his family. They just wouldn't be able to transport any living creatures bar those that were born of pure magic. The last thing Harry did before he gave the order to move out was use a series of spells to restore the seal on the portal and ward the portal from both the weather and intentional harm. After that, he placed several proximity wards that would alert him the moment someone approached the portal, when the portal was activated, and in the event that someone attempted to tamper with either the portal or his wards. He then collected Felix's reins, mounted the pale gray gelding, his coat appearing near white, and rode to the front of their small caravan in order to lead the way off of the mountain. It would take Group 5 days of hard travel to bring the wagons down out of the mountains. It would have taken far longer if Harry had not used his magic to clear the way along with the help of his and Naruto's clones. They were also lucky enough not to run into the bandits that had chased Naruto 3 years earlier. The group would pass into Kaze no Kuni within 20 minutes of leaving the mountains, and Harry halted the caravan the moment the solid ground beneath the horses' hooves turned into sands. Harry and Dudley would then spend an hour fitting the hooves of the horses with special runic boots that would temporarily transform the sand beneath their feet into a solid and level surface in a 3-foot radius from the point of contact. Harry had created the boots with the help of his rune instructor in order to provide the horses with a solid path across the desert to conserve energy, decrease travel time, and reduce the risk of the horses injuring themselves if they were to lose their footing on the shifting sands. Strips of steel lined with the same runes were then applied to all 16 wheels of the 4 wagons to prevent them from sinking down into the sand or tipping over. The boots and wheel covers would also work on snow, slush, mud, and gravel. The only time they wouldn't work on is a body of water that was more than 2 inches deep because the currents of the water and the surface tension were both always shifting. Crossing the vast desert would take 10 days, 5 days less than it had taken Naruto alone on foot, even if they could have crossed the desert in 6 if they'd traveled faster and farther each day. The reason for that was because Harry refused to push the horses in the intense summer heat. In fact, the group actually camped beneath a magical awning in the shade during the hottest hours of the day each day and frequently stopped during their hours of travel in order to offer each of the horses a drink of water to prevent them from becoming dehydrated. They could have traveled during the night, as Naruto had when he first crossed the desert, but that would have been just as dangerous due to the predators that stalked the desert at night and the chance that one of the horses would step in an unseen hole in the dark. The rune boots did not work on empty air for the same reasons they didn't work on deep or moving water. When they reached the forests of Tani no Kuni, the 5 of them camped beneath the trees for 2 nights in order to allow the horses to rest after the grueling journey across the desert. During those 2 days, Harry used his firebolt to scout the surrounding area from the sky with Minato's spirit hovering at his side pointing out important landmarks that would help prevent them from getting lost. He was also roped into taking both Naruto and Teddy for a couple of rides the moment they saw him pull out the broom. Both boys loved to fly nearly as much as Harry did. They packed up their temporary camp on the morning of the 17th and continued on their way, crossing into Hai no Kuni around mid-morning on the 18th. Their journey was quickly drawing to a close as they were now within 6 days' travel of Konoha, so long as they didn't run into any trouble. Under Minato's direction, the small caravan soon turned onto one of 3 roads that ran between Hai no Kuni and Kaze no Kuni and the road that marked the main trading route between the 2 great nations. From the moment they set foot upon the road, Harry felt exposed and vulnerable and the tenseness he radiated was transferred to whichever mount he was riding at the time. A day and a half after the group turned onto the road, the brewing storm that had Harry feeling on edge finally broke, figuratively speaking. At the time, Harry was riding Fidelis, the only black Andalusian. The normally placid gelding mincing his steps and dancing nervously beneath Harry as the pair slipped through the molted shadows that painted the ground through the boughs of the towering trees that loomed over the road. The only warning Harry had before they were attacked by a group of about 25 bandits was a startled grunt from the horse between his legs just seconds before their caravan was swarmed from both sides. Harry experienced a brief flashback to the year he'd spent on the run hunting Horcruxes with Ron and Hermione and the final battle, before he refocused on his current surroundings and recognized the fact that they were under attack. The knowledge that the bandits were attacking his little cousin and godson snapped something inside of him, shattering the moral compass that had prevented him from taking the lives of Death Eaters during the Wizarding War. Giving voice to a wordless battle cry of fury, Harry spun Fidelis on his heels and charged the bandits as a dozen Kage Bunshin, all 12 unexpectedly mounted on clones of the Dark Gelding, something that he had actually never done before, sprang into being around him in a cloud of smoke and joined the fray. Naruto, have your clones protect the horses. Arata, keep the wagons moving and get everyone out of here. Harry ordered in English, due to his memories of the past being stirred, as he pounded by the pair of frozen blondes perched on the driver's seat of the Vardo where Naruto had been chatting away to Dudley just before the attack. The wizard didn't wait to see if his cousins followed through on the orders, his attention quickly turning to the enemies in front of him as he drew the broadsword that had been sheathed in a saddle-mounted scabbard. Leaning low over Fidelis's neck, Harry barged right into a trio of bandits and knocked them off balance, the deadly steel in his right hand snaking out of its own accord to pierce a heart, cut off an arm, and open a gaping wound across a chest. Smoothly sitting up, Harry spun his mount back around to charge after the next group, slashing at their exposed backs as they attempted to chase after the wagons that were rapidly disappearing down the road. All around him, his clones mimicked him as they cut down their attackers with each swing of their blades, not a single one of them showing any mercy to the bandits. One scruffy bandit managed to catch a glancing blow to Fidelis' right flank with his club when Harry spun the gelding around in another tight circle to run down his next target, and the gelding bellowed in pain as he reared high and kicked his attacker in the head. Harry barely managed to keep his seat as the horse beneath him rose up vertically and lashed out at the man who'd injured him with his front hooves before he dropped roughly back onto all 4 feet, and he tossed his head as he danced in agitation and pain. Heart pounding, it took Harry 3 minutes to regain control of Fidelis before he could rejoin the fight. Another precious minute was then spent analyzing the battlefield before he pointed his horse in the direction that the wagons had been traveling and sent him flying down the road in order to catch up with the others. He would take note of at least 6 dead or unconscious bandits as he hurried to catch up with the others, evidence that Naruto had broken out of his stupor. 3 more bandits would fall to his blade before he caught up to the caravan, and the last 2 bandits still keeping up with the wagons on foot. Switching his sword for his wand, so as not to accidentally injure one of the horses secured to the back of the end wagon by lead lines, Harry dropped both thugs with well-timed stunners as he pulled even with them. Fidelis veered away from the men as they fell, and Harry pulled the gelding to a stop as he spun around to study their back trail to make certain none of their attackers had been able to slip away from his clones. Satisfied that the bandits had been dealt with, Harry created another clone and sent it to round up those clones that had survived the battle. He then dismounted and inspected Fidelis's injured flank, which had thankfully only been bruised according to his diagnostic scan, completely ignoring the 2 stunned bandits now that they posed no threat to his family. Not wishing to further injure the horse, Harry began leading Fidelis along the road on foot once he'd finished checking the injury. Half an hour later, the last 4 of his clones still in existence caught up to him, and he sent a pair of them on ahead to check in with the others, to make certain they were all right and let them know he was fine but on foot because Fidelis had been lightly injured. The final 2 clones were then sent into the woods on either side of the road to search for more potential ambushers in order to avoid being caught off guard a second time. As he walked, the 21-year-old was still in battle mode with adrenaline pounding through his veins with each beat of his heart, but the uneasiness he'd been feeling since stepping onto the road was gone. Harry wouldn't catch up to the others until well after sunset, when he stumbled into camp still leading Fidelis by the reins, one of the clones he'd sent to keep an eye on. The others had dispelled the moment camp had been made so as to let him know where to find the others. He'd barely announced his presence when he felt a human bludger with blonde hair plow into him as one of his elves tugged the reins free from his hand. The little beings refused to allow any of the humans to care for the horses at the end of each day, since there were few other jobs for them to do besides cooking while the group traveled. "I was so scared that I'd never see you again. I'm a little harder to kill than that, Naruto," Harry gently assured the blonde as he ran his fingers through the boy's hair and held him close, both man and teen falling back into Japanese now that the danger was over. "Were you injured during the fight, Takashi?" Eloise inquired as she approached the pair holding a squirming teddy. "Nothing more than a couple of scraps and bruises," Harry replied as he reached out to collect his godson. "I am tired though. You guys went further than I thought you had at first, and I've not walked so far on my own 2 feet in weeks. I think I'll start walking at least half of the day from here on out just to build up my endurance, since I won't always have one of the horses with me when I leave the village." "And how badly was Fidelis injured?" "I know your clone said it was just a bruise, but one of the bandits hit him with a glancing blow of his club. It's not too deep of a bruise, but it is large enough that I didn't think it a good idea for me to ride him once the fight was over. If the elves haven't done so already, he'll need some of the animal-friendly bruise balm applied to his right flank to ease the pain and stop his muscles from knotting up after walking on it for hours. I'll make certain he's taken care of while you and the boys go eat. They stubbornly refuse to eat until you caught up with us." "Thanks, Eri," Harry replied as he gave the shorter witch a crooked grin before allowing Naruto to drag him towards the Vardo where their supper was waiting for them. Harry slept like a rock that night, his dreams blessedly blank due to how tired he'd been from the short fight and the long walk afterwards, despite the fact that he'd fully expected to have nightmares because of the bandits that he had not hesitated to kill. He was up early the next morning and spent an hour checking the horses before deciding that it would be best to sit tight for another day in order to give Fidelis's bruised flank more time to heal before they pushed on towards Konoha. The others readily agreed with him as it gave them a chance to rest as well, because traveling for days on end was tiring even if they were practically traveling in luxury. Naruto challenged Harry to a friendly spar the moment he knew they were not going anywhere for the day, and Harry agreed, if only because it had been days since they'd last had a chance to train. Minato's shade played referee for them as they engaged in a taijutsu-only spar. The match would last a good hour and ended only when Naruto flopped onto the ground in utter exhaustion. The soon-to-be 11-year-old had tired himself out bouncing all over the place in his efforts to land a hit on Harry, while Harry used the least amount of movement to dodge or block the younger boy's punches and kicks. Dudley asked for a spar next so that he too could get in some practice. The two cousins smirked at one another while they waited for Minato to start their match, both 21-year-olds looking forward to trading blows. During their childhood, Harry would have done anything to avoid getting into a fight with his bigger and heavier cousin, while Dudley would have done anything to beat the tar out of his smaller and faster cousin. And while Dudley might have stopped bullying him after the Dementor attack around his 15th birthday, it wasn't until they'd moved to Japan that they both learned to enjoy pitting their skills against one another to see whose fighting style was superior. They were actually fairly evenly matched when it came to skill, though Dudley was still stronger with a longer reach and Harry was still faster and far more flexible. Their running tally of wins between the two of them was fairly close as well, Dudley currently leading their friendly competition by 3 wins. Harry would drop the slightly older man's lead by 1 at the end of their match because Dudley had also slacked off on his training during the journey. He'd been far too busy driving the Vardo, a surprisingly tiring job despite the fact that he sat on the top of a wagon all day long. After the 2 matches, Harry would spend the rest of the morning working with Teddy on his lessons. The teacher that ran the daycare had provided Harry with lesson plans and plenty of workbooks so Teddy's education wasn't interrupted, though Eloise usually gave Teddy his lessons while they traveled. At the same time, several of Harry's clones were out scouting the surrounding forest. Each clone paired up with one of Naruto's clones as the two of them taught themselves the art of tracking and worked on their stealth. The real Naruto, on the other hand, was diligently working on his chakra control. The kid currently looking like a walking bush beneath the thousands of leaves he'd stuck to his body and clothes by their stems alone as he walked up and down the tallest tree in their camp. Chakra control exercises were the only real training that both Harry and Naruto never skipped out on no matter what, since missing even one day would affect their control. While they were on the move, that usually involved an advanced form of the leaf concentration exercise, meaning that they made various objects stick to various locations of their bodies for hours at a time. The size, weight, and composition of the object, or objects, that they used in the exercise would have a rather large impact on how easy or how hard it was to maintain the hold on the object. A lightweight object that was rather fragile, like a leaf, was actually rather difficult to hold in place because using too much chakra would destroy the leaf. At the same time, holding a pebble or a metal disc in place would be far more tiring because they had to use a larger amount of chakra to keep the heavier object from slipping. Trying to hold multiple objects that were made up of different weights and durability was even more of a challenge because it required them to maintain different threads of varying amounts of chakra at the same time. Harry typically used a specially made set of glass discs, which was a difficult material to use for the exercise because chakra tended to slide off the smooth surface that he held in place on his chest, back, arms, and legs with chakra. There were a total of 20 discs in the set and each disc was a different size, weight, shape, and surface texture, which meant that each disc required a different amount of chakra to hold it in place. To prevent the discs from getting lost or destroyed, Harry had also carved a series of runes onto the top of each disc, one to prevent them from shattering, one to prevent them from melting, one that would repair any damage, if it was hit during a fight, and one to summon them back to their storage pouch if they fell off. He had 5 such sets of discs or a total of 100 discs, and not a single one had the same size, weight, shape, or texture as another disc. Harry typically switched out which set he used on a daily basis, to avoid falling into a rut by using the same set of 20 all the time, and occasionally worked towards actively carrying multiple sets. He could actually hold all 100 in place, providing he was sitting perfectly still and had no distractions, otherwise the most he could keep in place was 30. Naruto occasionally borrowed a set of the discs but the blonde actually preferred to use multiple leaves. After lunch, Harry saddled Felix and scouted their back trail for several miles to make certain that none of the surviving bandits had attempted to chase after them in search of revenge. He then circled wide to search the forest in the event that the bandits were using the trees for cover, like they had for the ambush. Once he was satisfied that they were safe, for the time being at least, Harry returned to the camp and checked in with the others before he scouted their way forward to search for more potential trouble. He only ran into a small handful of fellow travelers, most of them heading towards the capital city of Hai no Kuni for one reason or another. He returned to the camp in time to join the others for supper and then spent the rest of the evening playing with Teddy before he crawled back into bed. The expected nightmares made an appearance that night, but a long conversation with Minato's spirit had put Harry at ease as the man assured the wizard that he'd done nothing wrong. Taking an enemy's life was something that the spirit had actually been preparing both Harry and Naruto for from the moment the ghost learned that both cousins intended to become shinobi. The loss of his very rigid moral compass, which had been cracked and battered by the Wizarding War, made it easier for Harry to accept the lives he'd taken in defense of his family, though that didn't mean that he'd start killing every opponent he came up against. Camp was broken with the rising of the sun on the 21st after making certain that resuming their journey would not unduly stress Fidelis's bruised flank. It wouldn't, thanks to the bruise bomb speeding up the healing process, though Harry would not ride the dark gelding again for the duration of their journey. With only one mount available, the older mares he'd purchased trained strictly for harness work and the youngest mare and stallion still too young to ride, Harry would spend half of each day on foot for the rest of their journey, which he'd planned to do anyway. When he wasn't in the saddle, he would walk with Felix's reins in hand so that he could mount the gelding on a moment's notice if the need arose. Another thing that changed at the same time was that Harry started wearing a number of blades on his person, something he hadn't bothered with because the broadsword had always been close at hand on the saddle scabbard. He wore a pair of wakizashi blades on his back in a cross with one hilt poised over each shoulder for easy access. A katana hung at his left hip from a low-slung leather belt and a tanto was secured horizontally at the small of his back with the hilt on the right. A second tanto had also been secured to his saddle just below the broadsword where it could be easily drawn whether he was in the saddle or not. Additionally, Harry had his holly wand strapped to his right forearm and the elder wand strapped to his left, both of them in custom-made sheaths that made them look like daggers at a glance, an illusion that was further helped by the runes he carved on the handles of both wands to prevent muggles from seeing his wands for what they were, unless they were already aware of Harry's status as a wizard. He also had a number of kunai tucked into his clothes, but he'd been wearing those since before they'd stepped through the portal. 19 months ago, Harry would have felt awkward with so much steel secured about his person, but 18 months of hard training had erased any discomfort he would have felt walking around while carrying so many sharp and pointy objects. The last change in Harry's routine was the addition of 12 clones, all of them once again mounted on a cloned horse, spread out alongside of the small caravan on both sides. Each clone was hinged to look like a different person, most of them based upon all 7 of the male Weasleys and Harry's other male friends from England, in order to make it look like their group contained far more people than it actually did in an effort to make them less of a potential target for other bandits. Once an hour, the clones would rotate their positions and 2 of them would disappear into the trees on either side in order to scout for trouble before they fell back into place with the others on the next rotation. Mid-morning on the 22nd would see the small family encountering their first shinobi since they passed through the portal. Harry had been riding Felix about 30 feet in front the caravan as usual when 4 people had unexpectedly dropped down out of the trees to block his path. Felix had been spooked by their appearance practically under his feet and the gelding had reared up onto his hind legs in response. Harry quickly brought the horse back down onto all 4 feet by turning Felix's head to the left using the reins while his right hand automatically reached for his sword. His eyes firmly locked onto the 4 men that had appeared from out of nowhere. "I apologize for startling you, sir," the oldest man in the group declared as he raised both of his hands to show that he was unarmed. "We mean you no harm. We are Konoha shinobi and I was hoping that you would be willing to answer a couple of questions for me." "Gomen, I should not have overreacted, but I'm still a little on edge right now after our caravan was attacked by bandits 2 days ago and I did not realize that you were shinobi," Harry replied as he quickly resheathed his sword, so as not to appear threatening, and raised his free hand to form a 90-degree angle with his arm, the universal hand signal used to let others know you were stopping and their agreed-upon signal for his cousin to halt the wagons. "What was it that you wished to know, Shinobi-san?" "You've already answered a couple of my questions," the man stated solemnly. "My team has been tasked to round up the bandits that have been plaguing travelers in the area and I had intended to ask whether or not you'd encountered them during your travels. Would you be willing to tell me what happened? Give me a minute to reassure my cousin and I'll be happy to, Shinobi-san," Harry answered before he turned Felix around and trotted back to the Vardo in order to speak with Dudley. "Everything is fine, Arita. The shinobi are just looking for information on the bandits that ambushed us a couple of days ago." "That's a relief, Takashi. For a moment there I thought we were being attacked again. How do you know that they're shinobi though? The one that seems to be in charge told me they were shinobi and that they were from Konoha. I didn't notice it until after he'd said something, but all four of them are wearing those protector things with the swirly leaf on them, so they seem to be legitimate shinobi. I don't think they mean us any harm in any case, since they could have easily attacked us without warning. What with the way they dropped out of the trees without any forewarning, Felix didn't even catch scent of them before they appeared. Did you want me to go with you to answer their questions? Nah, I'd prefer that you stayed with the wagons and kept an eye on the boys. It shouldn't take me more than 10 or 20 minutes to answer their questions and see if they'd be willing to tell me how many miles it is to Konoha from here. Alright, if you change your mind, let me know. Harry nodded before he wheeled Felix around and headed back towards the four shinobi, 3 of whom couldn't be more than 16 or 17 years old. He pulled the gelding to a stop a good 10 feet away from the group and dismounted so that he could approach them on foot. Thank you for your patience, Shinobi-san, Harry stated once he'd reached the group of Konoha shinobi. It was no trouble, the man replied before he turned to address the 3 teens. Tanzu, take Minoji and Shibuya with you and talk to the rest of the guards and get their versions of the attack. The man then turned back to Harry and instructed, why don't you tell me what you remember? The bandits ambushed us just after lunch on the 20th, approximately 40 miles back. There were roughly 25 of them and they attacked us from both sides of the road. I met their charge head-on and held them off just long enough for my cousin to get everyone else out of there. I know I killed a number of them and injured several more of them before I sought to catch up with the others to make certain they weren't being chased. We ended up camping off the road for a full day due to my other mount being lightly injured during the fight. I scouted our back trail and the surrounding forest while we waited, but I don't know what happened to the surviving bandits after the attack. I found no evidence that they were hunting us down, but that hasn't stopped me from worrying. You fought off 25 bandits all alone? The shinobi asked skeptically. I wasn't exactly alone and I had the height advantage due to being seated on my horse at the time. Harry replied with a self-depreciating smile as he gestured in the direction of his hinged clones and avoided mentioning his ability to use the Kage Bunshin no Jutsu since it was frowned upon for civilians to use ninjutsu and Harry wasn't a shinobi, yet. How many of there are you total and was anyone injured? There are 5 of us plus a dozen guards and no one was hurt aside from one of my horses. I see. How certain are you about the distance you've traveled since encountering the bandits? Fairly certain. We've been traveling a solid 25 miles per day since reaching the road and we camped a good 10 miles away from where we were ambushed. We had a full day of travel yesterday and we've only been on the road a couple of hours today, so if my calculations are off, it isn't by more than a mile or 2. Might I ask where you are coming from and where you are headed? Our starting point was Yama no Kuni and we're hoping to settle down in Konoha, Harry answered without any hesitation since there was no reason to hide the truth. Speaking of Konoha, you wouldn't happen to know how far it is from here to the village, would you? It's just over 70 miles to the village from here, the shinobi replied readily enough, though Harry noted that the man had tensed slightly and was now studying Harry with far more interest. Arigato, shinobi-san, it is good to know that the end of our journey is close. I've grown weary of traveling and the children are starting to grow annoyed at being cooped up in the wagons for most of the day. You have children with you? The shinobi asked with some surprise. Yes, my son and my younger cousin. Their presence is the reason why I risked my life to chase off the bandits. I know you said that you've been tasked to deal with the bandits, but can you tell me if I can expect to face trouble in Konoha due to the fact that I killed a number of those men? No, you should be fine. It is not against the law to defend yourself from bandits. Arigato, I had hoped that would be the case, but many authorities are less than forgiving to those who kill, regardless of the circumstances. I suppose that would be true in most civilian villages, but Konoha is a military village and we tend to view things a bit differently than civilians, the shinobi stated as the 3 younger shinobi rejoined them. If you'll excuse us now, we've got to be on our way. Your cooperation with our investigation was appreciated and I hope that you and your family will find Konoha to your liking. Harry bid the shinobi goodbye a heartbeat later before he watched the 4 of them disappear into the tree tops. Shaking his head over the strangeness of traveling through the trees like Tarzan, only with less vine swinging and more chakra-enhanced dashing, Harry remounted Felix and signaled to Dudley to let him know that they were free to continue on their way. Minato and the other shinobi spirits he'd called on had told him that shinobi will often travel through the trees and over the rooftops, something Naruto had confirmed, but he hadn't quite been prepared to see it with his own eyes. Over the course of the day, Harry briefly caught sight of a number of shinobi moving through the trees now that he knew to look up, though none of them stopped to speak with him. The following day saw a marked increase in the traffic on the road, both civilian and shinobi alike, and cut their daily progress down from 25 miles per day to 20 miles a day, though the change of pace thankfully wouldn't cause a huge delay since they were already fairly close to their destination. The increase in traffic at least brought with it a measure of safety as bandits were less likely to attack anyone with so many shinobi passing back and forth along the stretch of road leading right up to the village. A new kind of tension entered the family of 5 as they steadily drew nearer to their destination. Naruto feared what would happen to him. He'd run away from the village almost 3 years earlier and he knew that the Hokage would not be pleased with him because of that. There was also the fact that most of the village had hated him from the day he'd been born, because of the Kyuubi, and he didn't know if he could face their cold, hate-filled eyes after experiencing true happiness with his cousins for the past 2 years. The 3 adults in the group not only worried about Naruto, all of them well aware of how the village had treated him, they worried about their own futures. They had basically turned their backs on their former lives in order to start over again in a world that was far different than the one they had left behind. They didn't regret leaving the outer countries, but that didn't mean they felt entirely comfortable with the world they had found themselves in. There was no turning back though, they'd come too far to turn tail and run home just because they were a little frightened of the unknown. It was just after lunch on the 25th of September that the Namikaze caravan reached the main gates of Konoha after watching the towering walls that surrounded the village rise out of the forest over the course of the morning. A steady stream of people poured through the gate in both directions and a glimpse through the open gates revealed a bustling hive of activity, including a number of shinobi dashing across the rooftops. Dudley pulled the Vardo off to one side of the road well back from the open gates, where it was out of the way, and the horses pulling the 3 wagons followed suit, the horses long used to following the wagon in front of them. Harry made note of their location as he dismounted from Felix and tossed the reins to one of his clones before he joined the short line of people waiting for permission to enter the village. The wizard had been unanimously selected as their family's spokesman despite the fact that Dudley was older. In no time at all, Harry found himself standing in front of a shinobi with messy black hair tied back with a hitai 8, black eyes, a close-cut goatee, and a white bandage bisecting his face over his nose. "Good afternoon and welcome to Konoha no Sato," the shinobi lazily greeted as he barely bothered to glance up at Harry, the slightly older man obviously bored. "Please state your name and business with Konoha." "My name is Namikaze Takashi," Harry replied, causing everyone in the immediate area to fall silent and glance sharply in his direction while the other shinobi on guard, this one with his bandana tied over the top of his head so that his dark brown hair hid his right eye and most of his face, jerked his head around so fast he fell out of his chair. "My family and I seek an audience with the Hokage in order to apply for citizenship." "Namikaze. Did you just say your name was Namikaze?" the shinobi on the ground demanded as he stared up at Harry with wide eyes. "Hi," Harry answered as he glanced towards the shinobi. The shinobi stared at him in return for a split second longer before he scrambled to his feet and disappeared in a swirl of leaves as he shined away. Harry felt a thread of unease fill him over the man's disappearance, but he pushed it down as he turned back to the shinobi that had greeted him and calmly asked, "Was there anything else you needed from me, shinobi-san?" Papers," the shinobi requested as he held out his hand. Harry nodded and pulled the envelope holding everyone's identification papers and passed the envelope to the shinobi. The man opened the envelope, pulled the sheaf of papers half out, and barely glanced at the papers inside before he signaled to someone out of Harry's direct line of sight. 2 masked figures wearing gray armor dropped down on either side of Harry a heartbeat later, and it was all the wizard could do not to automatically attack them as they brought back memories of Death Eaters. The only reason he wasn't attacking them was because Minato had warned him about the Umbu guards after Harry had told him about the Death Eaters. It helped that their masks were vibrantly painted animal faces and not white or silver skulls. "If you will come with us, Namikaze-san, we will escort you to the Hokage now," the shinobi in the dog mask on his right stated as he reached out to take the envelope of documents from the shinobi on guard. "One moment, Umbu-san, I will need to collect the rest of my family." Chapter 14, A Namikaze Homecoming. Tuesday, September 25, 2001, afternoon. Konoha no Sato, Hai no Kuni. Sarutobi Hiruzen skimmed through yet another mission report, this one detailing the routing of a band of bandits from the western road, before he initialed the report and set it on the stack of completed paperwork ready to be filed with a soft sigh of boredom. Instead of immediately reaching for the next report, he climbed to his feet and made his way over to the window to stare out over Konoha as he let his mind wander. It had been almost 3 years since the disappearance of Uzumaki. Naruto and Hiruzen still often wondered and worried about what had happened to the hyperactive child. During that time, the Sandaime Hokage had all but torn the village apart from the inside out in his efforts to find the 8-year-old. He'd unearthed a disturbing number of spies from all over the world and shut Danzu's root program down hard, but he'd not found even the smallest clue as to Naruto's whereabouts. Hiruzen had then rebuilt the village from the ground up, figuratively speaking, since most of the village had still been standing, before he carefully began to systematically search for the Kyuubi's young host outside of Konoha's walls. The results had been less than satisfactory, as they had not even found the ghost of a whispered rumor as to what might have happened to the child. Hiruzen had gone so far as to recall both Jiraiya and Tsunade to the village, despite their protests. He had sent Jiraiya back out to continue the search for the missing Uzumaki, after he'd had his former student upgrade the various barrier seals on the Hokage's office and in key locations around the village. Tsunade had been given a choice between taking over as the director of Konoha's hospital or starting a medical academy that would train future medics the moment an academy student or young genin showed an interest in the healing arts or demonstrated high potential, such as those with instinctive chakra control. After throwing a week-long tantrum over the ultimatum, Tsunade had opted to open Konoha's first medical school with the help of her apprentice, Shizune. That had been a year and a half ago, and the school appeared to be a rousing success. Those academy students that didn't have what it took to become genin but were still skilled enough to become medics were no longer lost to the system when they failed to pass the academy exam or the genin exam. Instead, those children were enrolled in the medical academy, where their abilities were honed so that they could one day take their place as a full-time medic at Konoha's hospital. Those genin that passed through the medical academy, on the other hand, would become future field medics where their skills would help save lives outside of the village. The Hokage's thoughts next turned to the clans. The Uchiha clan had not reacted well to Hiruzen's house cleaning, and their attempted coup was crushed in less than an hour when Hiruzen and his most loyal shinobi took them down hard on the heels of Danzu's removal. 2/3 of the Uchiha clan had died during the brief fight, and the only survivors were the children under the age of 10, at the time, the civilians that had never developed the Sharingan, and a very small handful of loyal Uchiha that had helped crush the rebellion. The most notable of the surviving clan members were Uchiha Itachi, the clan's beloved prodigy and the eldest son of the former clan head and former chief of Konoha's military police force, and Uchiha Shisui, Itachi's cousin. The situation with the Uchiha had made the other clans wary, but with the lesson of what happened to the Uchiha at the forefront of their minds, there wasn't any chance that they would attempt a rebellion of their own. That didn't stop the clans from eyeing each other with suspicion from time to time, especially those that had a history of contention between them. The tension between the clans and the civilians was even higher, as the clans blamed the civilians for the current problems while the civilians blamed all of the shinobi. Even after nearly 3 years, the friction between the shinobi and the civilians was both obvious and high. In fact, Konoha had lost close to 1/5 of its civilian population when the people had left the city in droves in response to the slew of interrogations that everyone, aged 14 or older, regardless of background or status, had been subjected to in the wake of Naruto's disappearance. On top of that, the number of civilians that had been looking to immigrate to Konoha had been drastically reduced once word began to spread about the house cleaning the village was undergoing. The fact that all potential immigrants were now required to subject themselves to intensive and intrusive interrogations before their applications would be accepted didn't really help. Hiruzen's attention was abruptly returned to the present at that moment as Kamizuki Izumo burst into the room quite unexpectedly and blurted out, "There's a man claiming to be a Namikaze at the gate." "Nani?" Hiruzen exclaimed as he jerked around to stare at the Chunin. "The man arrived at the gates a few minutes ago and stated that he and his family were seeking an audience with you as they wished to move to Konoha. He introduced himself as Namikaze Takashi." "Describe them to me," Hiruzen ordered as he returned to his desk. "The man is in his early 20s and stands about 5'6" with a slender build. He has messy black hair that sticks up all over the place, a faded lightning bolt scar on his forehead, and piercing leaf green eyes. He wore at least 3 swords on his person, carried himself like a shinobi, and his chakra levels are at least equivalent to a high jounin, though I'd put them closer to Kage level based upon how potent he felt from a distance of 5 feet. I did not see the rest of his family nor was any mention made of how many of them there were in total before I left my post to report to you. The man's description sounds familiar. Hiruzen mused with a slight frown as he reached for the most recent mission report he'd reviewed less than a half an hour earlier. He skimmed through the report until he reached the part where the Jounin described the leader of a small caravan that he'd spoken to in regards to the bandits. Sure enough, the description of the man in the report matched the description of the man Izumo had given him. The man should have arrived with a small caravan of 4 horse-drawn wagons with a mounted guard of 12. A caravan of that description was sitting a ways back from the gates just off the road. A masked Umbu guard appeared in the room in a curl of smoke at that point and passed an envelope to the Hokage as he reported. Torai and I just escorted a small family of 5 individuals, 3 adults and 2 children, to the tower. Torai is currently keeping an eye on them in the lobby as we speak. Thank you, Inu, send them in, Hiruzen instructed as he set the envelope on the desk without opening it and reached for the red and white Hokage's hat with the kanji 4 fire on it so that he could place it on his head. Hokage-sama, with all due respect, I suggest you take a look at all of the identification papers in the envelope before you meet with the family, Inu stated as he made no move to obey the Hokage's orders. Hiruzen frowned at the silver-haired Umbu guard before he did as suggested and opened the envelope that the man had handed him. The topmost packet was the identification papers for one Namikaze Takashi, but Hiruzen barely glanced at the photo of the green-eyed man as he was distracted by the fact that the format of the form was identical to the forms that Konoha had used for all native-born citizens up until 3 years earlier. His frown deepened because he knew that there had been no Namikazes born in the village since Naruto's birth, and his father's birth before him, and the only way someone born outside the village could have known to use the older format was if the documents were a forgery, one of the reasons that the forms had been altered after Naruto disappeared. The Sandaime was certain that there was no way the black-haired man could be a Namikaze, if only because the man looked nothing like Minato, bar the fact that his hair was a veritable bird's nest. Flipping to the next packet, Hiruzen found himself face to face with a green-eyed child with sunshine yellow hair that bore a startling resemblance to the missing Uzumaki, Naruto, minus the whisker marks. The boy's name was Namikaze Satoshi and he was Takashi's son according to the information on the top page of the packet. Hiruzen's certainty that the first man was a fraud slipped as he stared at the child. When he flipped to the third packet, the Sandaime Hokage felt like he'd just been sucker punched in the gut as an oh-so-familiar face stared up at him. The boy in the picture was older than he remembered, but there was no mistaking those sapphire blue eyes, that sunshine yellow hair, or those whisker marks. Hiruzen immediately knew that this was what Inu had wanted him to see and he was torn between sharp relief and white-hot rage as it dawned on him that Naruto had finally been found. It was at that point that the Sandaime finally noticed that the last name on Naruto's paperwork was listed as Namikaze and not Uzumaki and his blood ran cold. There was a reason why Naruto's parentage had been considered a state secret and it had nothing to do with his status as the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi and everything to do with the number of enemies that his father had made during his lifetime. Needing time to think, Hiruzen flipped to the final 2 packets to find a blonde-haired, blue-eyed man that bore only a passing resemblance to Minato and a passably pretty young woman with long curly black hair and brown eyes, Namikaze Arata and his wife of almost 2 months Eri. Slightly confused as to how a quartet of unknown Namikaze could pop up from out of nowhere, Hiruzen flipped back to Takashi's identification packet and skimmed through the man's background information and his eyebrows nearly climbed off of his face when he learned that the man's grandfather was Namikaze Kichiro. Hiruzen knew exactly what had happened to Kichiro. He'd been the one to authorize the man's expedition to the outer countries 50 years earlier, just 1 year after being named as the Sandaime Hokage. Hiruzen had all but forgotten about the broken 14-year-old that he'd pretty much sent out into the world to die all those years ago. When they hadn't seen or heard from the teen after 5 years, Hiruzen had assumed that the teen had died after passing through the portal. He never once considered the possibility that the man might have survived, let alone produced a family. How Kichiro's grandsons managed to find Naruto was even more of a mystery, since the only way the Namikaze family would have escaped notice all of these years was if they'd remained in the outer countries. Hiruzen was confident that there was no way that Naruto could have known about Kichiro or Kichiro's family since the kid had never been told who his parents were. He was also worried about what it meant that Kichiro's grandsons had chosen to return to the village now, after all of this time. Izumo, return to your post, Hiruzen ordered once he'd collected himself. Inu, fetch our guests and tell Tori to guard the door to ensure that we are not interrupted. The aged Kage then addressed the room at large. The rest of you need to vacate my office for the duration of my meeting. Hi, Hokage-sama, 6 voices intoned in sync before 4 puffs of smoke and a swirl of leaves filled the office while Inu opened the door to collect the small family, waiting on the other side. The young newlyweds entered the room first and Hiruzen took a moment to study the confident young man that looked like a pale copy of Minato. He was tall, just an inch or two shy of 6 feet, and stocky with the hint of a beer belly. He walked with a slight swagger that was tempered by the pleasant, if small, smile he wore on his face. The man wore a sun-bleached pair of blue jeans and a gray t-shirt that were both lightly coated with dust and dried sweat stains, a clear indication that he'd spent at least part of the day on the road. The woman beside him looked positively dainty in comparison. Namikaze Eri stood a whopping 5 foot 4 inches with a moderately plump frame that spoke of a rather easy civilian lifestyle. She wore a loose, sleeveless yellow summer dress with a black and yellow striped shawl draped loosely around her shoulders. And while her clothes were obviously travel-worn, they were nowhere near as dirty as her husband's, an indication that she'd stayed inside of the wagons for long periods of time. Propped on the woman's hip was the 3-year-old Namikaze Satoshi, the young child attempting to take in everything with his wide green eyes. Hiruzen's eyes were then drawn to the other child in the group as Uzumaki Naruto walked through the door next. Naruto had shot up like a weed since the last time he'd seen the boy and there was not a single trace of baby fat to be found on his lean frame. He also carried himself with far less brashness and more confidence, even if it was obvious that the boy was tense and nervous. Dressed in dark blue jeans and a burnt orange t-shirt, the kid was a sight for sore eyes and the old man's heart soared to see his surrogate grandson safe and sound at last, even as his heart ached when he noted the angry scowl the bewhiskered boy sent at him. Before the Sandaime could think of a reason why Naruto would be angry with him, his eyes were immediately drawn to the last member of the small family, almost against his will, as the man strode into the office on Naruto's heels. The man exuded a presence that demanded attention as he moved with a natural grace equal to that of a stalking tiger. Any shinobi worth their salt would recognize the warrior in the young man in a single glance, and those that missed the visual signs of the man's occupation would sense it in the tightly leashed power that clung to the man. Those who were stupid enough to ignore those signs would likely end up dead the moment they irritated the man. The dark-haired man was dressed in loose black pants, a dark red long-sleeved shirt, and a heavy black trench coat. He had 3 swords strapped to his back, a 4th to his left hip, and a dagger strapped to each arm, the hilts peeking out from the end of his coat sleeves. On his feet he wore bulky knee-high boots that completely enclosed his feet. Dust clung thickly to the man's clothes along with hundreds of short white hairs that Hiruzen assumed to be from the horse the man was reported to ride. Inspection complete, the Sandaime lifted his eyes to the man's face. The moment Hiruzen met Namikaze Takashi's gaze, he had to fight the urge to rear back and apologize to the man. It had been over 11 years since the last time he'd been on the receiving end of what he'd secretly termed the Namikaze death glare. It was a look that Minato had only ever used when he was pissed beyond words, and even Orochimaru had squirmed like a new-made genin beneath that particular glare. Any doubts that the green-eyed man was not who he claimed to be fled in that instant. That particular look could never be reproduced by anyone other than a Namikaze, and Hiruzen wondered what the hell he'd done to piss off a man he'd never even met. Good afternoon, lady and gentlemen, I am Sarutobi Hiruzen, Sandaime Hokage of Konoha. Please allow me to welcome you to Konoha. Inu, please take the children. Touch my son and I will break your fingers. Touch my Otoko and I will cut off your fingers. Attempt to remove either child from my sight and I will skin you alive, salt the resulting wounds, slow roast you over an open fire, and feed you to my dogs inch by inch starting from your feet, all the while making certain you live through the entire process. Takashi interrupted in a deadly soft voice filled with icy rage as his eyes turned even colder, and Hiruzen wondered if the glare he now saw was the last thing that Minato's enemies had seen just before they died at the hands of Konoha no Kiroi Senko. Excuse me. Hiruzen barked in shock as Inu palmed the hilt of his sword in response to the threat. Takashi and I isn't very happy with you right now, Hokage-sama. Naruto explained with an aggrieved sigh, and the Sandaime flinched imperceptibly at being addressed so formally by the blonde. Not that I'm all that happy to see you either. Takashi and I also doesn't trust you, and that means he's not going to let me or my Otuto out of his sight because he's rather protective of us. And what exactly is it that I have done to anger a man that I've never set eyes on until now? Where would you like me to start? Takashi retorted as he dropped his hand on Naruto's head to silence him. With the decision you made to allow an entire village to heap verbal abuse on a helpless child? With your decision to allow this village's civilians to form lynching mobs that would chase a helpless child through the streets? Or maybe it was the decision you made to lie and withhold information from said child and let him think that his parents hated him just as much as the rest of the village? Or how about the fact that you left a child to fend for himself in a hostile environment where your entire village not only shunned him, belittled him, and threatened him but also took pains to steal and destroy his worldly possessions and overcharge him for the basic necessities he needed to survive? Hiruzen opened his mouth to make a retort, but the younger man didn't give him a chance to get a word in edgewise as he raised his voice slightly and continued his angry rant. I despise men like you with a passion. I knew a man that was like you once. I saw him as the grandfather I never had and thought that he could do no wrong. He too was the vaunted leader of an entire society, despite the fact that he was not the figurehead of the government, a powerful icon and a war hero that was respected all over the world. He was a smart and talented man as well, and over time he began to believe that he was the only one with the knowledge and power to guide his society down the right path. His short-sightedness and his absolute belief in his own hubris that he termed the greater good nearly destroyed our entire society. He forged a child weapon once too. Only he didn't want a powerful weapon that could turn against him. So he made a broken weapon that was loyal to a fault and eager to please but lacked the skills and knowledge he needed to fight the battles he would face. A weapon that cared nothing for his own life because he had no sense of self-worth, a weapon that was revered and reviled at the drop of a hat by an entire society, and a weapon that was meant to sacrifice himself for the greater good. That man died over 5 years ago and I still haven't forgiven him for manipulating me all of my life just to set me up as a sacrificial lamb for a society that blamed me for all of their problems while they simultaneously demanded that I save them. It infuriates me to know that that you, attempted to do the same thing to my Otoko. Don't hold back now, Takashi, tell the man how you really feel, Arata interjected in a dry tone. Urusai, Arata, Takashi muttered as he immediately deflated in response to the other man's words, his anger vanishing in the blink of an eye. The dark-haired Namikaze then bowed low and contritely stated, Maushiwe karimasen deshita, Hokage-sama. I should not have spoken to you that way. We have been traveling for weeks and the moment we arrived at the gates of your village, we were dragged before you without even a chance for us to rest, let alone wash the dirt from our faces. I suppose it did not help that I have been nursing my anger for nearly 2 years and would have preferred to have kept my Otoko as far from this village as humanly possible. And your attempt to shuffle the kids off to some place else was just the last straw. I am also aware that it is not entirely your fault that Naruto-kun was treated so poorly while he lived in your village. You are, after all, only one man. It is just hard to not hold you responsible for everything now that I am standing in front you. Apology accepted, young man, Hiruzen replied after studying the man for several seconds. Why don't we start over? You can begin introductions. Arigato, Hokage-sama, Takashi murmured in relief as he bowed a second time. My name is Namikaze Takashi. Behind me are my cousin Namikaze Arata, his lovely wife Namikaze Eri, my son Namikaze Satoshi, and I believe that you are familiar with my youngest cousin, Uzumaki Naruto. Uzumaki. Not Namikaze. How is it that Naruto-kun's identification papers declare him to be a Namikaze if he is still referring to himself as Uzumaki? Hiruzen inquired with some surprise. Naruto. When did you find the time to switch the packets? Takashi declared as he turned to the now sheepish blonde. For that matter, why did you switch them? I thought we agreed not to reveal your relationship to Minato until you were at least 15 or a chunin. I didn't like being the odd one out, Naruto confessed with a shrug of his shoulders. I suppose I should have expected that and you should have said something sooner. No point is squabbling about the matter now though because what is done and you have every right to use your father's name. Just don't go flaunting your surname about when you eventually step out of the villager. Wakata, Keishinii. Namikaze-san, would you be opposed to allowing Inu to take the children to get a treat while the rest of us have a short discussion? You have my word that no one will harm either child while they are in Inu's care and that they will be returned to you as soon as we are finished. Hiruzen watched the man tense once more as his gaze cut down and to the side towards Naruto before flicking to the young child in the woman's arms. The young man then turned to study the masked Inu for a full minute before he dropped his gaze to the floor and canted his head to one side, as if he was listening to something only he could hear. A few seconds later, the man nodded his head, lifted his eyes to meet Hiruzen's gaze, and replied, "I will allow it." He then turned to the young woman and held out his hand. Eri quickly set the child in her arms down on his feet and the boy rushed into his father's arms as the man crouched down. "Toshi-kun, the gentleman in the red and white doggy mask is going to take you and Naruto-kun to get a small snack and I need for you to be on your best behavior while you are out. Can you do that for me?" "Hi, Papa," Satoshi replied with an enthusiastic nod. "Remember, no changing no matter how cool you think someone looks." "Hi, Papa," Satoshi murmured with a slight pout. "Naruto, I expect you to keep an eye on Satoshi for me and make certain he doesn't get into any trouble." "Hi, Nizan," Naruto immediately agreed as he scooped up the younger boy and settled him on his shoulders. "Where are we going, Inu-san? How does ramen sound?" Inu inquired with an undertone of amusement. Hiruzen held back the grin that threatened to break out as Naruto's entire demeanor changed the moment the word ramen passed through Inu's lips. It did his old heart a world of good to know that the child he'd been so fond of was still there inside of the not quite 11-year-old beneath the serious, and angry, child that had entered his office. Mendakusei. "Here, Naruto, you'd better take this, I know how you are when it comes to ramen." Takashi sighed as he fished a bulging money pouch out of his left coat pocket and tossed it to the blonde. "Try not to eat yourself sick." "Thanks, Keishinai. You're welcome, Squirt," Takashi replied with a fond smile that slipped from his face when he turned his gaze back to the masked Inu and delivered a warning. "If any harm comes to either child while they are in your care, I will hunt you down and hurt you in ways you couldn't possibly imagine and no one will ever find your body by the time that I am finished with you." "Understood, Namikaze-san." The two children and Inu were gone 2 minutes later and Hiruzen activated the privacy barrier and one of 3 alert beacons that surrounded his office with a pulse of chakra, knowing that activating the beacon would also let Ibiki and Inoichi know that their presence would be needed. The aged shinobi then leaned back in his chair and studied the 3 young adults in his office as he allowed the displeasure he'd been hiding to show. "Now, why don't we get down to business?" Hiruzen stated in a stern tone. "You can start by giving me one good reason why I shouldn't have all 3 of you arrested on charges of kidnapping." "You mean aside from the fact that we are not guilty of kidnapping anyone?" Takashi countered as he crossed his arms over his chest and arched an eyebrow as he calmly looked Hiruzen in the eye. "Just under 3 years ago, Uzumaki Naruto vanished from his apartment and the village without a trace. Are you implying that you had nothing to do with his disappearance? Until 2 years ago, we didn't even know that the elemental countries existed," Arata stated as he shoved his hands in his pockets to hide his clenched fists. "Until Naruto turned up on my parents' doorsteps out of the blue 2 years ago we never knew that we had family living on this side of the portal. In other words, Hokage-sama, we didn't kidnap Naruto," Takashi added once Arata had finished speaking. "And you expect me to believe that Naruto-kun miraculously transported himself across the barrier that separates our world from the outer countries and lost a full year of time in the process?" "No," Takashi snorted as he fished out a thick document-sized envelope from the inside of his trench coat, broke the seal with a thread of chakra, and tossed it on the desk. "It's more like Naruto discovered the fact that you'd been lying to him his entire life and he ran away from the village in order to search for the only possible family he had and found us a year later." Hiruzen frowned even as he reached for the envelope. He quickly opened the envelope and withdrew the thick sheaf of very familiar documents that were inside. 5 minutes later, Hiruzen was feeling his age weighing down on him once more after he confirmed that the documents in the folder were the unaltered originals that were supposed to be safely stored in the archive with the rest of the village's important outdated documents. Originals that he had not even known were missing as he'd never once thought to have someone check the archives for thefts because the barriers around the building had been undisturbed, something he should have checked on anyway. "I still find it hard to believe that an 8-year-old child could have slipped out of the village without alerting one of the Umbu guards that I had assigned to watch him. Naruto is a very enterprising young man and when he is properly motivated, he can pull off some pretty amazing pranks and schemes," Eri shyly pointed out as she spoke up for the first time since entering the office. An alert would have been sent the moment he crossed the defensive barrier that protects the village and an Umbu team dispatched to retrieve him even if he did manage to evade the guards assigned to him, Hiruzen insisted. Takashi snorted as he lifted his right hand just enough to raise 2 fingers as he drawled, "The answer you are looking for is comprised of 2 words, Hokage-sama, Kage Bunshin." Naruto knew that the Umbu were dispatched each time he was chased out of the village by angry mobs and he took advantage of that and the rampant misconception That he was incapable of performing ninjutsu because of poor chakra control. Poor chakra control, I might add, that was strictly due to the enormous size of his reserves thanks to the furball hitching a ride inside of him and the piss-poor teachers that were sabotaging his education. Speaking of the Kyuubi and the fact that Naruto is the fox's host is a crime punishable by death. How does that apply to me? Takashi countered with a scowl. I was not born in this village and therefore am not aware of any laws that were created after Minato's death. And it's not like I spoke of the Kyuubi out in the middle of the village where anyone could overhear me. On top of that, how often have you even bothered to enforce that law? After all, a large percentage of the adults in this village went around breaking that stupid law each time they called Naruto a demon within his hearing. The law was my attempt to prevent the adults from spreading their hate to their children, but looking back now, I can see that it failed to provide Naruto with a measure of protection as I had hoped it would. Hiruzen admitted wearily as he pulled off his hat and returned it to the bottom drawer of his desk before he pulled out his pipe, stuffed it full of tobacco leaves, and tamped the leaves down before he lit the pipe. He drew deeply on the pipe, held his breath for a moment, and then released the smoke in a series of smoke rings before he asked, "What exactly is it that you want from me? Why are you here in Konoha? Why bring Naruto back to Konoha at all if you didn't want to be here?" Minato told me that I had to have Naruto back in Konoha by his 12th birthday. Minato is dead, Hiruzen deadpanned as he tried not to gape at the green-eyed man. Oh, there has never been any doubt that my cousin was well and truly dead when I first met him, Takashi quipped with a grim smile. His spirit has been a veritable font of information and anecdotes about life in the elemental nations over the past 2 years, specifically within Konoha. How is that even possible? One aspect of my Kekkei Genkai is an ability that allows me to communicate with the dead. Prove it, Hiruzen ordered impulsively. Takashi arched his eyebrow again before he glanced to the empty air beside him and nodded his head to the side once in question. Hiruzen thought the young man might be touched in the head only to nearly swallow his pipe when Minato's shade shimmered into existence in the exact place that the other man had been staring. He attempted to dispel a genjutsu several times before he scrutinized his pipe as he wondered if someone had slipped a hallucinogenic into his tobacco, when he wasn't looking. You're not imagining things, Sarutobi, and you are not in a genjutsu, Minato's shade pointed out with a laugh. You can't be here, you're dead, I saw you die. And I am still dead. How do I know that you are the real Minato and not just an illusion? Would you believe that I am me if I was to remind you about the day Kushina and I caught you peeping on the women bathing in the hot spring using your nifty little crystal ball when you were supposed to be going through your paperwork? Damn it, did you have to bring that up now? I still have nightmares about that day. You could have picked a different memory to prove yourself, you know. Why? It's so much more entertaining to watch your face turn red in mortification and horror over any reference to that day when Kushina invented Konoha's Senengoroshi, and gave you a personal demonstration. Naruto couldn't stop giggling like a loon when Kushina first started teaching us how to use that particular technique. She called it the ultimate pervert punishment. Takashi snickered as he bit his lip and ducked his head. Have you been here all this time or did you only appear just now? I've been here the entire time. Why are you dragging around Minato's ghost? Hiruzen demanded as he turned back to Takashi. Normally, the spirits I call upon leave as soon as I release them. Unfortunately, there were a couple of complications involved in Minato's case and he'll be a permanent fixture in my life until I can find a way to fix it so that he can finally enter the afterlife and join his loved ones that have already passed. So, it's more that I can't get rid of him rather than a desire to hold him here. You never did finish answering my questions, Takashi-san. Hiruzen stated in order to divert the attention away from the discomforting topic of dead shades, and his embarrassing personal history. Aside from the belief that Naruto was required to be here by this time next year, why are you here? If you still had a year's time before you had to return, why come back sooner if you didn't want to be here? Minato advised us to turn up around Naruto's 11th birthday in order for us to have plenty of time to get settled in before Jiraiya turned up to claim him as his apprentice. And I am here because I refuse to allow Naruto to return to a place where he had been hated alone and without a friendly face. You intend to become citizens of Konoha? Hiruzen asked with some surprise. Yes. Once the hospital has confirmed that the two of you are descendants of Namikaze Kichiro, gentlemen, I'm certain that we can issue you your citizenship as a civilians of Konoha as a blood relation to a current citizen. Hiruzen began as he automatically reached for the form to request a full medical screening for all 5 members of the small family. Actually, Hokage-sama, I'm looking to join the shinobi force alongside Naruto, Takashi corrected, his declaration making the Sandaime freeze. And I was hoping to apply for a business license and any permits necessary so that I could open a restaurant, Arata added a heartbeat later. I don't anticipate there being any issues with you joining the village as a businessman, Arata-san. Attracting new businesses has been difficult during the past 3 years due to a recent reorganization of the village's infrastructure and bylaws. The restaurant and food industries in particular took a heavy hit these past few years as a number of businesses pulled out of Konoha. On the other hand, Takashi-san, you are far too old for me to send through the academy alongside of Naruto. I will not allow Naruto to be sent back to the people that sabotaged his education. He worked too damn hard over the past 3 years to correct the damage they did. There have been many changes in the academy curriculum since Naruto vanished, and all of the staff have been sent through an intensive evaluation to ensure that they are all qualified to continue teaching the future generations of our shinobi forces. I can arrange for Naruto to take an assessment test to determine whether or not he'd benefit from taking a minimum of 1 year at the academy. Should he score high enough, I will gladly clear him to take the graduation test to earn his Hitaide instead, providing that is what he wishes. That would be acceptable, Takashi allowed as he relaxed once more. I would be willing to take the same assessment tests in order to demonstrate my knowledge and skills. Actually, before you interrupted me, I was about to tell you that you would be required to visit the Konoha hospital for an intensive medical examination to ensure that you are in optimum health. After that, it would be necessary for you to demonstrate the full range of your skills to a panel of seasoned jounin to determine if you have the skills necessary to join the ranks of Konoha's shinobi. Once we know whether or not you are physically capable of performing as a shinobi, you would be required to take a handful of assessment tests before we can arrange for you to be tutored in those subjects that you scored poorly in. That doesn't sound too different than what Minato told me to expect. You still wish to apply for a place on the shinobi force? Hi, no point in wasting the grueling training I suffered through over the past 2 years. Hiruzen nodded in response and grabbed 5 medical evaluation forms, a merchant's application, which doubled as a business license application, a shinobi application, a supplemental citizenship application, for Takashi's son, and after a quick consultation on the young woman's intentions, a standard civilian's application for citizenship. Once he handed the applications over to the 3 adults along with their identification papers and the packet of legal documents, he politely asked them to fill out the applications right then before he kicked them out of his office. Ibiki and Inoichi joined him a moment later. The 2 shinobi had been waiting just out of sight outside of his window for just over an hour now. Chapter 15, Running the Gauntlet. Tuesday, September 25, 2001, late afternoon/evening. Konohagakure no Sato, Hai no Kuni. Harry dropped down into the nearest chair in the lobby just outside of the Hokage's office and stared at the thick stack of forms he'd been handed by the Hokage with distaste. He was at least thankful that the application he was required to fill out was nowhere near as thick as the one Dudley had been given. With a small sigh of resignation, Harry dug into his cloak pocket to grab a quill and a bottle of ink, just 2 of the mundane items he kept in the magically expanded pockets of the cloak, a habit picked up from his year on the run during the war, and began the tedious task of filling out the numerous forms, starting with the rather short one that he'd been given to fill out for Teddy. Just a few feet away, Dudley and Eloise were similarly occupied. It only took Harry about 15 minutes to fill out the supplemental citizenship application, as all it had asked for was Teddy's basic information, such as name, age, gender, birth date, current level of education, and next of kin. There was also a medical release form that required his signature authorizing the release of Teddy's medical information. He then filled out a similar form for himself that was a total of 3 pages and asked for the same information as Teddy's form in addition to his martial status, his current financial situation, a list of his assets, a list of past and current employment, and a list of his job skills, not including his shinobi skills. He was also required to answer close to 50 questions about his reasons for moving to Konoha and whether or not he'd ever been convicted of a crime. The next section of his application was another medical release form followed by a trio of medical form packets that would need to be filled out by the medic that performed his son's, and his cousin's medical evaluation. Harry just had to fill in his, Naruto's, and Teddy's personal information at the top of each page on both sides, 1 packet for each of them. When he picked up the next section of his application, he briefly thought he'd been given an extra medical evaluation packet by mistake until he realized that the packet was actually for a mental evaluation. He grimaced distastefully over the need for his mental health to be assessed by perfect strangers but diligently added his personal information to the spaces provided at the top of all 4 pages on both sides. That brought him to the last and largest section of the application, a 20-page questionnaire about his shinobi skills and knowledge. The first page focused on general information, such as the age at which he began his shinobi training, how many years he'd been training, if he'd been an official shinobi of another village, the name, or names, of any shinobi that he'd been apprenticed to, what level he estimated his skills to be at, which branches of the shinobi arts he had training in, and which branches of the shinobi arts he was interested in training in. He was also asked several questions about the level of his chakra control, the size of his reserves, if known, and whether or not he had a Kekkei Genkai. After that there were 9 pages that each focused on one of the 9 main branches of shinobi arts, taijutsu, ninjutsu, shurikenjutsu, genjutsu, kenjutsu, iriajutsu, fuinjutsu, kinjutsu, and senjutsu. Harry would only fill out the questionnaires for 5 of the different branches, taijutsu, ninjutsu, shurikenjutsu, kenjutsu, and fuinjutsu. He had no talent for genjutsu or iriajutsu, not to mention a lack of the fine control required for both branches, and he had not received any training in kenjutsu or senjutsu. The 9 pages following those were the evaluation forms for the 9 branches, and all Harry had to do was fill in his personal information 18 more times for those. The final page was yet another evaluation form, this one intended to record his current force, speed, and stamina ratings and predict his latent potential and luck. Finished, Harry flicked the quill clear of ink before he set it aside and shook out his aching hand. He then took a moment to shuffle through his and Teddy's application to double-check all of his answers, mostly to make certain he hadn't used his or Teddy's birth names at any point. He put the applications back into order at that point and rose to his feet to approach the masked shinobi that was currently doubling as the Hokage's secretary, in order to make it known that he'd finished filling out his application. While he waited for instructions on what he was supposed to do next, Harry checked with his cousin and his cousin-in-law to see if they were finished. Eloise had finished hers but was currently helping Dudley fill out his application. Namikaze-san, the Hokage will see you now. Please make certain to bring your completed application and pertinent legal documents and records with you. The bird-masked Umbu guard that had escorted him to the tower alongside Inu stated a moment later. Harry sighed and gathered up his application before he squared his shoulders and re-entered the Hokage's office. The first thing he noted was the 2 intimidating gentlemen that now flanked the Hokage. The one on the left was a bear of a man standing at roughly 6 feet 4 inches with a pair of painful-looking scars bisecting his face. The stony expression he wore did not inspire warm and fuzzy feelings in the wizard, but it also didn't set him to shaking in his boots. Harry had seen more terrifying scowls on any number of older and stronger wizards. The second man had long blonde hair, creepy pupilless blue eyes, was only 3 inches taller than Harry, and his mere presence set Harry on edge for some reason. Allow me to introduce you to Marino Ibiki, head of Konoha's torture and interrogation department. The Hokage announced the moment Harry came to a stop in front of his desk as he gestured to the bear-like man on his left. And Yamanaka Inoichi, one of our top interrogators and one of my trusted advisors. They are here to assess your current mental health and verify that you do not intend any harm towards Konoha or her people. If you will pass me your paperwork, Takashi-san, I will begin reviewing your application while they evaluate your mental health. Harry stiffly passed his application and his packet of legal documents over to the Hokage before he glanced to the man that had been introduced as Ibiki to wait for instructions. The bear-like man arched an eyebrow in surprise before he shot a questioning look at the blonde man, and Harry suspected that they'd expected him to shy away from the scarred man instead of ignoring the blonde. The blonde was far less intimidating in appearance, after all. It wasn't Inoichi's looks that bothered the wizard though, it was the uncomfortable feeling that the man could do him harm above and beyond physical pain that made him wish to avoid him. I suggest that you avoid attempting to enter my cousin's mind in order to view his memories, Inoichi. You will not like the results, Minato advised as he shimmered into view once more, his appearance startling both interrogators. Drop the genjutsu, Namikaze-san, Ibiki ordered tightly. I am not using a genjutsu. I am incapable of using genjutsu because I lack the control necessary and therefore never bothered to learn more beyond the basics of how to recognize when one was cast on me and how to break it. I can sense that you are channeling chakra right now. If you are not maintaining the illusion of the Sandaime Hokage, then what are you using the chakra for? Inoichi countered as he scowled at Harry. Ah, that's easy to explain. Harry replied as he dug through his pockets for the empty pouch that was tied to the set of glass discs he was currently sticking to various parts of his body. In order to maintain what little control I have over my chakra, I have to consistently work on my chakra control every day. I usually put my discs away when we make camp each evening, but because we're no longer on the road, I forgot. Harry then set the pouch in the palm of his left hand and placed his right index finger over the recall rune sewn on the pouch and activated the rune at the same time as he ceased channeling his chakra. The pouch in his hand abruptly filled up, accompanied by the sound of clinking glass. Harry shook the pouch to make the discs rattle once more before he slipped the pouch back into his pocket. Problem solved, any? No, there is still the matter of the illusion of a dead man that is standing in the middle of the room, Ibiki countered in a low growl. Minato can be annoying at times, but he's not a bad person and he is family. My maternal aunt, on the other hand, is a real piece of work, and I think I'd seriously consider committing suicide if her ghost ever decided to haunt me. That woman was 3 pies short of a holiday feast, if you want my opinion. Ignore the ghost, he's not a figment of your imagination and he will not harm anyone, the Hokage stated as he glanced up from Harry's application to address the 2 shinobi. His presence is tied to a Kekkei Genkai that Takashi-san told me he possesses, which allows him to communicate with the dead, and I've already confirmed that it is not a trick. Why can't I view his memories? Inoichi asked Minato's spirit after he digested the Hokage's remark. Scanning his memories would be the fastest way for us to determine whether or not it would be a risk to allow this young man to remain in Konoha. Same reason why you'd be a fool to attempt to view my son's memories, Minato answered after he glanced at Harry for permission to reveal the presence of his passenger. Harry willing gave it because he knew that the Kyuubi's presence would have been noted during his medical exam anyway. You're a Jinchuriki. How is that possible? Are there bijou running wild in the outer countries as well then? The Hokage demanded in rapid fire as he slammed Harry's paperwork on the desk and half rose out of his chair. Harry crossed his arms defensively as he answered the Hokage's questions in a clipped tone, in order, yes, long story, and no. I don't trust you enough to say another word on the matter right now. The only reason I let you to know about my status now is because it would have become readily apparent the moment you sent me for my medical exam. Is it actually a bijou that you are holding then? Yes. Will you at least tell us which one of the 9 bijou you are holding? Ibiki inquired as his scowl deepened slightly. No. I don't fancy having my personal secrets spread about the village. If it becomes necessary at some point in the future for you to know about the furball, then I will reveal that information to those that need to know. Will you allow me to bring in a seal master to inspect your seal? The Hokage asked as he cleaned up the scattered forms he'd dropped. If you are referring to Yamaguchi Jiraiya, then yes. Anyone else can go hang themselves. Yamaguchi-san has at least been given ringing endorsements by 2 people that I trust, as both Kushina and Minato have told me that the man knows what he is doing when it comes to Fuinjutsu. Yes, I was referring to my student. I will summon him back to the village so that he can inspect your seal and Naruto's seal to ensure that neither seal suffered any negative side effects from passing through the portal. The subject of Harry's burden was dropped at that point as Ibiki and Inoichi began interrogating him while the Hokage returned to his perusal of Harry's application. Most of the questions they asked seemed repetitious, as they asked the same question at least 10 different ways, as if they were purposefully trying to trip him up. They started with his social development, moved on to his emotional development, and then switched to his moral beliefs. After that they asked him about his bad habits, his views on authority figures, and how old he had been when he first took a life. They morbidly prompted him for a total number of kills he'd made and asked if he'd ever been tortured before, inquiring whether or not he suffered from nightmares. They then switched tracks again and asked him what family meant to him, if he had any happy memories, and if he had any hobbies that helped him to relax. They even broached the topic of his sex life to his mortification, and all 3 of the older men in the office had stared at him in shock when he admitted to still being a virgin. He'd never gone past the kissing stage, after all. That had them questioning Teddy's parentage, but Harry was quick to point out that he never hid the fact that his son was adopted. The 2 men wrapped up the mentally and emotionally exhausting interrogation by readdressing his feelings regarding taking another's life in self-defense versus assassination, if he had any reservations about stealing, and whether or not he had any anger management issues or self-destructive tendencies, such as drinking in excess, taking recreational drugs, experimenting with explosives, or inflicting bodily harm upon his person. When it was over, Harry answered a couple of questions that the Hokage had in regards to his training before he collected his legal documents and stumbled from the room. He happily noted that the dog-masked Inu had returned with the children at some point while he'd been grilled over the past hour and felt a measure of tension he'd been feeling since the children had been escorted from his side disappear. The weary wizard then commandeered the only couch in the lobby and promptly made himself comfortable before he fell asleep with Teddy curled up on his chest and Naruto parked on the arm of the couch to stand guard over the two of them. While he slept off his exhaustion, Dudley and Eloise were both subjected to mental assessments, though their interrogations were not quite as intensive as they weren't looking to become shinobi, both separately and individually, due to their marital status. Once the couple was finished, Naruto was called into the Hokage's office for an interview and Dudley didn't hesitate to insist on sticking to the kid's side while Harry was out of it. The Hokage was less than pleased not to be allowed to question Naruto alone but let the matter slide because the young blonde was a minor and the man had no wish to incite Harry's anger a second time. Once the Hokage let Naruto go, Inu and Tori, the bird-masked Umbu, were tasked with escorting the small family to the hotel suite that had been rented on their behalf, which would include guiding them to a vacant lot near the hotel where they could secure their wagons. Naruto was given the unenviable job of waking Harry up from his nap which saw the preteen being covered from head to toe in bright pink, pale purple, and eye-blinding yellow paint courtesy of the paint-filled balloon bombs that Harry had been carrying in his pockets for some reason. Naruto was not impressed with his new look and Harry was not happy to be awake which for some reason made both masked shinobi snicker each time they caught sight of a paint-covered Naruto or the shuffling half-asleep zombie that was Harry. By the time they reached the wagons, Harry was wide awake, if still exhausted, and he spent a good 20 minutes inspecting all of the horses and wagons before he dispelled his shadow clone guards, to the surprise of their escort. He then tossed Teddy up on Felix's saddle before he smoothly mounted the gelding, gave Naruto a hand up onto the saddle behind him, and moved to the head of the caravan while Eloise climbed up onto the driver's seat of the last wagon, for appearance's sake, and Dudley took his usual seat on the driver's seat of the Vardo. Harry then let the two Umbu guards know that they were ready to move out. It would take them a half an hour to navigate the busy streets with the wagons in order to reach the vacant lot. Another hour was then spent setting up a temporary camp and unhitching the horses, the elves unable to help due to the number of people watching them. It would have taken even longer if Harry and Naruto hadn't supplied a handful of clones each to groom, feed, and picket the horses. The clones would then be left to watch over the camp and make certain that no one would bother the horses, a task made easy thanks to the pre-carved ward stones that Eloise had set up around the perimeter while the others had tended the horses. The sun had set by the time they finished and the group quickly packed overnight bags with a couple changes of clothes, toiletries, and a few other odds and ends they thought they might need. Their next stop was the nearest restaurant to pick up a couple boxes of takeaway since they had no plans to leave their hotel room once they checked in for the night. Their escorts then took them to their temporary lodgings and Harry was pleased to note that the hotel was neither overly pretentious nor completely run down, meaning that he had not need to fear for his wallet being hit hard either due to extravagant costs or unscrupulous neighbors. The group bid goodnight to their escort, both parties well aware of the fact that the two masked shinobi would watch over them until they were relieved by another pair of guards, took turns taking showers as they ate, and then promptly went to bed, Dudley and Eloise taking the bed while Harry and the two children camped out on the floor. Harry would sleep reasonably well that night considering that he slept on hard floor in a strange room that sat in the middle of an unfamiliar village, his nightmares held at bay by sheer exhaustion. Harry was up with the rising sun the next morning, a long-standing habit since the day he began his shinobi training and education 2 years ago, and dressed for the day. Before he created a couple of clones to keep an eye on the others. He then slipped out of their suite, exited the hotel, and made his way to the wagons on foot. He was vaguely aware of the shadow he picked up the moment he left the hotel but paid the shinobi no mind as he ran through his morning exercises before he groomed Felix and Fidelis and saddled both geldings. Harry then mounted Fidelis for the first time since he'd been injured, after making certain the bruise was fully healed, and set off to explore the village while most of the residents were still in bed. He eventually stumbled across a wide empty field lined with trees, not unexpected considering what he knew of the village, and spent another half an hour putting Fidelis through his paces while keeping a close eye on the dark gelding to make certain the workout didn't do him any harm. Once the half hour was up, Harry took the horse through a cool down before he spent a half hour working Felix, after which he made his way back to the wagons. He found the rest of the family there tending to the rest of the horses, bar the 2 stallions, whom Harry would deal with once he'd finished with the geldings. The 5 of them had time for a light breakfast before a messenger arrived from the Hokage informing them that he'd made arrangements for them to be given their medical assessments that morning. Inu arrived 20 minutes later in order to escort them to their appointments, the gray-haired shinobi running late as usual, though none of the travelers were bothered by that. It wasn't until they arrived at what looked like a newly built school that Harry realized something was up, as he'd expected to be led to the hospital for their appointments. His apprehension was laid to rest just 5 minutes later when Harry learned that their medical assessments were going to be handled by Senju Tsunade and her apprentice, Kato Shizun. Harry knew who Tsunade was thanks to Minato's lessons, and he knew that her medical skills were as legendary as her temper. 3.5 hours later, Harry was not nearly as pleased to have such a renowned medic administering his exam after he had been subjected to a full battery of tests, and a second interrogation, this one revolving entirely around his medical history. He was also less than pleased to discover that Tsunade got a kick out of embarrassing the hell out of him as she asked far too many pointed questions in an effort to determine if his sexual inexperience was the result of a social issue or a medical issue. Harry retaliated when it was all over by hitting the woman with a slow-acting balding jinx. She would go bald over the course of a week and then stay bald for another week before her hair grew back. The only thing that had stopped him from using a faster form of retribution was his need for her to fill out his medical evaluation, hopefully with positive results. Teddy and Naruto's exams were nowhere near as intensive, as they were too young yet to worry about needing to go through half of the exams, and therefore Tsunade finished with them rather quickly, with Teddy being required to revert to his base form in order to get accurate results. Shizun, on the other hand, had handled Dudley and Eloise's exams, both of which had been nearly as thorough as Harry's. The only reason they didn't receive quite the same battery of tests as Harry was again due to his decision to apply for entrance into the shinobi forces. Ordeal over, Harry happily hightailed it out of Tsunade's domain and vowed to avoid getting injured at all costs, lest he be forced to endure Tsunade's brand of course humor in larger doses. An elf-made lunch consisting of his favorite dishes and the afternoon split between playing with Teddy and Naruto and sparring with Naruto and Dudley went a long ways towards restoring his mood. After supper, he spent the rest of the evening lounging about their hotel suite while watching Naruto and Teddy play around with blocks. The next morning, an unfamiliar man wearing the standard uniform of a Konoha shinobi, a dark blue long-sleeved shirt, dark blue pants, open-toed boots, also blue, green flak jacket, Hitai 8, with dark blue bandana, and a weapon holster strapped to the middle of the right thigh, turned up at the vacant lot. The man's dark brown hair was secured in a messy ponytail at the back of his head, his eyes were a dark brown bordering on black, had a long scar that ran across the bridge of his nose, and wore a friendly smile as he greeted Harry and stated that he was there to collect Naruto for his scheduled assessment tests. Naruto recognized the man as Yumano Iruka and greeted him with cautious enthusiasm, an indication that the man hadn't treated Naruto too terribly before, but that Naruto still felt unsure about the man. Wary of just letting his cousin wander off with a stranger, even if Naruto did know the man, Harry determinedly tagged along while leading a saddled Tenio, the Andalusian stallion. As they walked, Harry grilled Iruka about how long he anticipated Naruto's assessments to take, between 6 and 8 hours. When they arrived at the academy, Harry passed Naruto money for lunch, bid him good luck, and promised to return later to collect him, waiting until Naruto vanished into the building before he created a single clone to monitor the area and keep watch for the blonde. Harry then wandered off to the same clearing he'd used the day before in order to train Tenio for a couple of hours under the eyes of yet another masked shinobi. He started by warming the stallion up using the lunge line before he created a Kage Bunshin and cast a featherweight charm on the clone. The clone quickly mounted the stallion in order to teach the horse to respond to hand and knee signals without the fear of getting bucked off or hurting the young stallion. Harry continued to keep hold of the lunge line as the clone worked the horse, just in case the clone fell off or the horse was spooked, as he had no desire to chase a runaway stallion on foot through the streets of the village. After a full 2 hours of training, Harry led the horse back to the vacant lot where he rubbed him down before returning him to his picket line, which was on the opposite side of the camp as the Shire stallion. He would pass another 3 hours of time working with Teddy on his lessons and eating lunch at a rather popular dango stand. He then took Teddy window shopping and people watching, two of Teddy's favorite pastimes, right after flying, horseback riding, and playing with Naruto, of course. After Teddy grew bored of that, Harry wandered in the direction of the Shinobi Academy and killed time by pushing Teddy on the rope swing that had been tied to the tree that sat directly across from the Academy building after dispelling his clone. Naruto burst out of the Academy an hour later, the blonde eager to escape the stairs. His peers hadn't seen him in 3 years, after all, and the mind-numbing tests. He was ecstatic to find both Teddy and Harry waiting for him, and he eagerly tackled Harry with one of his power hugs before he kidnapped Teddy from the swing, twirled him around a couple of times, and plopped the toddler on his shoulders. The three of them then ambled off in the direction of the wagons while a bemused and slightly regretful Yumino Iruka trailed along behind them, to make certain they didn't get lost or ambushed. The morning of the 28th would find the family of 5 once again standing in the Hokage's office as the Hokage went over the results of their medical and mental evaluations while Tsunade, Shizune, Ibiki, and Inoichi offered the occasional comment and Inu stood silently off to one side. The Sandaime started off reporting a positive confirmation from their blood tests. Dudley, Harry, and Naruto were all related, which they'd already known. Unsurprisingly, Harry was also distantly related to Teddy. His mother and grandmother had both been blacks by blood, as had Harry's paternal grandmother, meaning that he and his father had both been blacks as well. Next, the Hokage went over the results of Naruto's and Teddy's medical results, which were all positive in nature, both boys exceedingly healthy. A vaccination schedule was then set up for Teddy, as he'd need to be given the remainder of his childhood immunizations, those that differed from the ones he'd received on the outside, as well as his booster shots, over the next 5 or 6 years. Just before the Hokage moved on to the next set of results, he declared that Naruto was remarkably well adjusted despite his rather rough start in life. That was the closest the man would ever come to saying that Naruto's 3-year vacation from the village had been beneficial for the boy. Dudley's assessments were covered next, and while he'd passed their mental evaluation with no problems, something he would not have managed just 4 of 5 years earlier, there were a few medical concerns. His childhood had been very hard on his health. His parents' overindulgence and his unhealthy diet for the first 14 years of his life had left a mark on his body. He was currently healthy, after spending roughly 6 years turning his lifestyle and diet around, but he had a mild case of diverticulitis that would grow worse with age, a strong likelihood of heart disease in his future, a high risk of developing type 2 diabetes, a guarantee that he would suffer from arthritis in the future, and a defective chakra network. The good news was that most of the health risks he faced could be controlled and contained with regular medical checkups, a closely monitored diet, and regular exercise. There wasn't much that could be done to correct the problems with his chakra network, but since he intended to live the life of a civilian, that wouldn't have that large of an impact on his life, since he had no need to mold chakra. However, if he was willing to allow Tsunade and a couple of other medics to study his chakra network, there was a chance that they could develop treatments for children that suffered from the same or similar defects. One such child was an academy student by the name of Rock Lee. To Harry's everlasting surprise, Dudley readily agreed to allow the medics to study his chakra network, further proof that his cousin had truly changed his way of thinking. Once Dudley finished making arrangements with Shizune, both for his next medical checkup and for a screening of his chakra network, the Hokage moved on to Eloise's results. Eloise had passed her medical evaluation with flying colors, thanks in part to her magical core, though she would need to visit a medic regularly for the next 9 months. Apparently the newlyweds hadn't quite been careful enough during their 2-week-long honeymoon, and Eloise was about 6 weeks pregnant. Neither Eloise nor Dudley were too sad about that. They both wanted at least 2 or 3 children, though they had originally intended to hold off on starting a family until after they were settled. The results of her mental evaluation weren't quite as stellar, though they hadn't found anything that would prevent her from being granted citizenship in Konoha. It was more that she was suffering from a mild case of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that had been caused by 6 years of bullying and the recent Wizarding War. On top of that, she still had low self-esteem, which was also partly due to the bullying along with her lack of confidence in her magical abilities due to being a low level witch, meaning that her magical core size and strength fell below average for her age group. Both issues were fairly easy to address with therapy though, which was why her results wouldn't see her application for citizenship denied. The Sandaime called for a break at that point so that everyone could grab something to eat for lunch. After the meal, Harry would return to the Hokage's office alone, but for his masked escort to face the Hokage and his evaluation panel in order to hear his results. He actually passed both evaluations by the skin of his teeth, and that was mostly because of the figurative bombshell he dropped on them in the form of his status as a Jinchuriki. Mentally, he had been diagnosed with a rather severe case of PTSD, due to his numerous adventures at Hogwarts and the large part he played in the recent war, something he'd already been aware of and had been in the process of dealing with during the year leading up to their departure from Japan. That condition alone would not have been a problem, simply because there were very few shinobi who didn't suffer from some form of PTSD due to their rather violent profession. No, the reason he nearly failed the mental evaluation was because he was also suffering from a condition known as magically induced soul trauma, MIST, that was caused by excessive exposure to dark magic, specifically with the dark magic associated with the unforgivable curses. Of course, the shinobi were not aware of MIST and therefore had misdiagnosed the condition as a severe anger management issue coupled with extreme mood swings. Treatment would involve monthly therapy sessions with Ibiki, since Harry wanted nothing to do with Inoichi, for at least 2 years, unless he showed marked improvement. Intensive physical training, to allow him a release for his anger and frustration, and encouragement to indulge in those activities that he found soothing and relaxing. He would also be placed on the Umbu watch list for the foreseeable future, something Minato had warned him would probably happen even if he had passed his mental evaluation, with flying colors. Harry's response to both his diagnosis and the proposed treatments was rather anticlimactic. He simply shrugged his shoulders and accepted that he was messed up in the head, something that he'd known for years. The Hokage moved on to his medical results at that time, and while he was clearly healthy, his magic made certain of that. There were several anomalies that concerned them. The first and most concerning was the current state of his chakra coils. The Shinigami had done him no favors in turning him into a host and forcefully expanding his coils. The constant increasing influx of the Kyuubi's chakra wasn't exactly helping the situation either. The only reason he was still alive, still had a functioning chakra network, and wasn't in constant pain was because his magic was constantly working to repair the damage to his coils as they continued to expand to accommodate the Kyuubi's chakra. The treatment they proposed to deal with it involved expending large amounts of chakra on a daily basis, in order to make room for the influx of chakra, and weekly appointments with Tsunade to have the stress damage healed, which would ease the strain on his magic, not that they were aware of that tidbit. When they asked if he knew why his chakra coils were such a mess, since his coils should have had more than enough time to adjust to the Bijuu's chakra during his childhood, Harry found himself reluctantly informing them that he'd only been a host for approximately 2 years. That had shocked them to the core, as had the information that he'd had no shinobi training, and therefore no chakra training, prior to becoming a host, and that his coils had been forcefully expanded in order to accommodate the Bijuu's chakra. When Tsunade had demanded to know how the hell he had survived the sealing, Harry had given her a pained smirk and told her that surviving was what he did best before using the Kekkai Genkai card to explain things. The next issue addressed was the presence of a highly concentrated antivenin in his blood, one that they couldn't match to a corresponding venom. Harry couldn't exactly tell them about the basilisk without explaining about his magic, something that he was not ready to trust them with as of yet, and so instead simply claimed that the snake that had bit him had been a one-of-a-kind creature that was the equivalent of a boss summons. When asked what happened to the creature, Harry truthfully told them that he'd killed it and that was how he'd gotten bit. The last anomaly had everything to do with Harry's magic. Unlike Eloise, who was on the low end of the spectrum, Harry was rather powerful magically speaking, a direct result of his difficult childhood, his numerous adventures at Hogwarts, and the war. He also had the potential to grow stronger during the last 4 years before he reached magical maturity at age 25. On top of that, he had been a level 5 mage prior to the Shinigami shoving the Kyuubi into his body, and mages were actually fairly rare in this day and age, since few magicals were actually faced with the trials necessary to open their magical cores. The difference between a mage and a powerful wizard was that a mage's entire body was suffused with magic due to their magical cores being opened, meaning their cores allowed their magic to flow freely between their core and their body. That didn't mean that a mage could use wandless magic willy-nilly or that they were constantly walking around radiating wild magic. It just meant that the majority of their magic was not restricted to their core. Being a mage was a double-edged sword as well, since the free-flowing magic meant they healed faster and that their bodies received a boost that made them just a little bit faster, a little bit stronger, and a little bit harder to bruise. Unfortunately, that also meant that extreme magical exhaustion would affect them physically as well as magically, since their body would temporarily lose the extra boost that their magic gave them. Mages were measured, not by the size of their magical reserves, though they were always magically powerful, but by the degree to which their core had been opened. There are exactly 9 levels, with level 1 being the lowest and 9 being the highest, formally placing Harry right in the middle of the scale at 5. His current level was a bit harder to determine because his magical core was still in a chaotic state due to the sealing of the Kyuubi, something that wouldn't have that much of an impact on his casting unless he drained his core completely, but made it difficult to determine the amount of magic flowing between his body and his core. An immature magical became a mage when they endured and survived a magically traumatic event that ripped open their magical cores while their cores were still flexible enough to recover from the damage done. A mature wizard in the same situation, if they lived, would end up losing their magic completely because their core could no longer adapt or heal the extensive damage. Harry's core had been opened on the night that Voldemort had first attempted to kill him with the killing curse. Once a mage has been awakened, meaning his core has been opened, subsequent traumatic events would increase the mage's level, which meant that the size and/or number of the tiers in his core would increase to allow for a larger amount of magic to flow into the body. Unlike an awakening, it was not necessary for magic to be involved in obtaining the next level. Physical or severe emotional trauma could see a mage jumping in levels. In Harry's case, he reached level 2 as a direct result of the malnutrition he suffered through his childhood due to an inadequate diet because his body had required more magic in order to compensate for a lack of proper vitamins and minerals. At the same time, his magical core expanded to increase his magical reserves and the amount of magic his core produced because his body was constantly drawing on his magic. The rest of Harry's growth as a mage occurred during his years at Hogwarts. Level 3 reached in his second year when the basilisk had bit him and Fawkes healed him with his tears. Level 4 had been reached at the end of his 5th year when Voldemort had possessed him shortly after being emotionally traumatized by Sirius's death. And he reached level 5 when he'd been struck with a second killing curse at age 17, ridding himself of Riddle's Horcrux at the same time. The other dangerous situations that he'd ended up in only saw his magical reserves being expanded further in order to accommodate the high volume of magic his body used to constantly heal itself. Being turned into a host for half of the Kyuubi's soul will have undoubtedly increased his level yet again. The only question was whether he gained a single level, which was guaranteed because of the trauma involved, or if he gained multiple levels, simply because of the severity of the trauma involved, most of which had been directly to his magical core and chakra coils. It was that free-flowing magic spread throughout his body that Tsunade had noticed, and because she had no knowledge or understanding of his magic, she had no idea what it was she was seeing. In the end, the anomaly was again attributed to his Kekii Genkai, which is basically what his magic was. The Hokage and Tsunade both grumbled a bit when Harry refused to give a detailed explanation of exactly what his Kekii Genkai entailed, but they had pretty much expected the secrecy since few Kekii Genkai carriers ever gave out secrets that could see them killed one day. Harry was dismissed not long after that with instructions to be at the training field where he'd been exercising his horses at 7 the following morning to meet with the panel of shinobi that would be assessing his shinobi skills. That's it for part 4. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.